Thomas and Friends is an amazing show with many amazing seasons, but one season that just doesn't get enough respect in my opinion is Season 9. A lot of people would say that it was a bad season, but I strongly disagree because it has an awful lot of episodes that I truly love and only a few duds like Rheneas and the Dinosaur. Today, I'm going to discuss my favourite episode of this season, and it may surprise you. Most Thomas fans say that the best episode of the 9th season was Respect for Gordon, Molly's Special, Percy and the Oil Painting, or Thomas's New Trucks, and I can see why, except for Thomas's New Trucks, that episode sucks for me. My favourite episode of this season is Thomas and the New Engine. Yes, you heard me. This episode is an incredibly overhated one, and one that I have a lot to say about. Let's get talking. I love this episode. It's probably my favourite of the entire hit era, seasons 8 to 12 is how I categorise it. Why? Because firstly, I have massive nostalgia for it. This was the first episode of Thomas and Friends that I ever watched, so nostalgia really slaps here. But this episode is great, even with all that aside, and here are the reasons why. First, the tone of this episode. A lot of people complained that the hit era was completely childish and gimmicky, and that Thomas was too nice. Not that I agree with that statement, but this episode is nowhere near childish and gimmicky. In this episode, Neville, the New Engine, is falsely accused by Thomas of being friends with Diesels, and when he tells this story to James, it spreads and escalates to a point where Neville is evil and wants to assault Sodor's steam engines, and the other engines are aggressive to him as a result. This is not what I would call gimmicky. This episode shows just how cruel some of the Northwestern Railway's engines can be, and how they react to a supposed threat. This is almost the exact same kind of behaviour present in the Railway series, as well as a solid moral situation. The concept of spreading false rumours before finding out the whole story is a really good one, and it also proved that the hit era wasn't always sunshine and daisies. It had its tough, sometimes cruel moments while not forgetting the young audience. Another thing this episode did wonders for was Thomas's character. I will admit that Thomas was a bit too nice in the hit era, but in this episode he is set up perfectly. At one point in the episode, Thomas sees Neville pulling Annie and Clarabelle, his coaches, and this adds to his fury and refuses to talk to him. This is Thomas spot on in my opinion. However, this episode doesn't forget that Thomas is also the hero of the series. Near the end of the episode, Neville, still pulling Annie and Clarabelle, crashes onto a broken bridge that Thomas didn't warn him about. When Thomas realises that Neville isn't best mates with the Diesels after all, he arrives at the scene of disaster and attempts to rescue Neville and succeeds. The scene where he pulls Neville off the broken bridge really portrays him as heroic. It isn't completely in your face about Thomas being a saviour, like Misty Island Rescue was. It just merely implies that Thomas did the right thing, while also being flawed and not a complete saint. And finally, the action. The bridge crash in this episode is fantastic. It was a gosh darn unique way to show the consequences of negative rumour spreading. And just look at the visuals. The model work in Season 9 was excellent, and it's what got me into Thomas and Friends as a young lad. It's at its best here in the crash. The shot where Neville slides to the edge of the bridge gripped my attention when I first saw it, and I was barely a year old back then. Another thing I love about the crash is how serious it is. A former Thomas YouTuber, the Thomas Cynic, made a video on the fantastic action sequences of Thomas and how they could be unique, serious, and even funny. Well, this episode does wonders at making a serious action scene. Most of the crashes in the hit era ended in "oops" or
"luckily, no one was hurt,"
and it really doesn't show any seriousness or humour at all, which really frustrates me. But this episode's action sequence is a total outlier. Remember what I said earlier that Neville was pulling Annie and Clarabelle, a passenger train in other words, when he crashed on the bridge? Well, that's not something you would normally hear in such a casual tone. That kind of incident could have killed all the passengers on board, and that is no joke. The narrator does a spectacular job describing how serious the situation is, and you can really feel a sense of tension during the whole scene, and it gets even more suspenseful as Thomas approaches the bridge himself. The music itself is super tense too, props to Hartshorn. I said earlier that this episode gets a lot of hate, and now I'm going to harp on about how ridiculous this episode's criticism is. I talked about how perfect the tone of the show is set in this episode. Well, most of the fandom hate the episode for that exact same reason. Everyone says, the Seam team were so horrible in this episode, or this episode was so mean-spirited, I hate it.
Shut up!
Those exact same people hate on Season 9 simply because Thomas is too nice, or because the season's writing is so dumb and gimmicky. Well, here you all are, an episode with a serious, cruel plot and a jerky Thomas. Oh no, that's not what you wanted either. People say that Thomas intentionally spread rumours about Neville when he clearly did nothing wrong, but that is not true. Thomas didn't see the entire situation, he only saw Ari and Bert laughing at Neville and felt a bit suspicious, yet he flew off the handle when he saw Neville with his coaches. If Thomas was happy about Neville being with Annie and Clarabelle, everyone would complain that he is out of character. Speaking of character derailment, some people also claim that Edward is out of character, and that he should know better than to spread rumours about other engines. Well, how would you feel if you heard about a newcomer who wanted to beat the people of your kind? Pretty upset, I'd think. I'm not saying that Edward was 100% in character during the hit era, but my point is, his actions in this episode doesn't make the episode on the whole suck, and if it's written engagingly or creatively, it works. The highs of this episode outweigh the lows, which we'll move on to now.
Look, nothing.
Anyway, let's conclude. This episode is a masterpiece. The story is realistic, serious, and not what I would call gimmicky or the bane of Wilbert Awdry's existence. This episode is what brought Thomas into the life of the guy you're listening to now, with great model work, action, morals, and it set up the main character perfectly. It keeps Thomas close to his classic persona, while also making him the hero of the story. And to top all that, I like to think of the new engine as me, a complete newbie to the world of Sodor, and learning about how it's not all fun and games. The engines can be aggressive, selfish, and even discriminative. If you hate this episode, maybe you should think again. I hope those of you who are watching have understood my points on why this episode is so underrated. I hope to have more videos in stock, maybe more Thomas or something different. This has been the Yellow Striker, and until next time, slán go fóill.